Since its release in 2008, Metal Gear Solid 4 has remained an exclusive to the PlayStation 3. With its low resolution and even lower frame rate, however, it's a game that felt trapped by its hardware. That is, until now. This is Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots, running at 4K, 60 frames per second, with 16x anisotropic filtering. No, this isn't a remaster, though it gives us a taste of what one might look like. This is RPCS3, the PlayStation 3 emulator, running on a PC. You see, after a recent video I did on MotorStorm, I wanted to dig a little deeper into the world of RPCS3, and naturally started exploring games that had never received ports to other platforms. Metal Gear Solid 4 is one such game. Thus, on this video, I wanted to step back briefly and explore the history of Metal Gear Solid 4 leading up to its release, including a look back at the original TGS trailer running at 60 FPS, while also examining the state of MGS4 on RPCS3 and touching on the various issues I encountered along the way. Plus, we'll have a whole suite of comparisons of the game running on a real PlayStation 3 versus RPCS 3. So, let's get into it. At Digital Foundry, we always desire the highest possible frame rates with new game releases, but also understand that this isn't always possible. Yet Metal Gear Solid 4 is an interesting case, as it's a game that teased us with the possibility of 60 frames per second, only to stomp on our dreams with its eventual final release. What do I mean? Well, to better understand this, we need to flash back to 2005. Metal Gear Solid 4 had been announced at E3 2005 via this teaser trailer, basically announcing the return of Hideo Kojima to complete the story he started with the second Metal Gear Solid title. After rumors of his retirement from the Metal Gear Solid franchise, this was seen as good news, and in fact this new game would be designed for the just announced PlayStation 3, promising major technical improvements for this next installment. And our very first taste of those improvements would arrive just a few months later at the Fall Tokyo Game Show, when Konami and Kojima produced and released a trailer showcasing their vision for a next-generation Metal Gear Solid game. It looked really impressive at the time, with a massive leap forward in terms of character rendering quality, but what stood out even more was the frame rate. You see, this trailer delivered all these gorgeous visuals at a smooth, stable 60 frames per second, something we hadn't seen since Metal Gear Solid 2. I gotta say, this TGS trailer really ends on a rather unexpectedly spicy note. Kojima Productions was all in on the console wars.
コンピューターアーキテクチャに革命をもたらした高性能マルチコアチップだよ。軍事にも利用されてる。
そんなものが戦場に必要なのか？
あ、プラットフォーム戦争に勝つためにはね。
At the time, there was little reason to doubt that the final version of Metal Gear Solid 4 could deliver visuals at this quality. After all, the famous MGS2 trailer presented 5 years prior also ran at 60 frames per second, and the final game would actually exceed that trailer in terms of visual quality. So surely, we could expect the same with this one, right? Well, as it turns out, this trailer was produced prior to receiving actual PS3 development hardware. I have no specific insight into Kojima Productions' development situation, mind you, but I have spoken with other developers that were involved with the early days of PlayStation 3, and all of them have suggested that the final hardware was a step down from what was promised by Sony. So bringing visuals of this caliber to the actual PlayStation 3 would be no small task. So when the game finally arrived in 2008, and after further trailers have been shown on real hardware, it was obvious that this original target demo had not been achieved. Visually, it's reasonably close on the surface, but performance-wise, it's not in the same ballpark. On real hardware, MGS4 mainly targets 30 frames per second, but with its double buffer VSync setup, it regularly drops to 20 frames per second. It doesn't run especially well. But more curiously, and I remember discovering this myself, in select circumstances, you could catch pockets where the frame rate would actually jump up to 60 frames per second for just a moment, suggesting that the game was unlocked but ultimately limited by its double buffer VSync setup. Was the potential for 60 frames per second always hidden within? Well, fast forward 14 years and the dream is now nearly a reality, thanks to the tireless efforts to emulate PlayStation 3 on the PC with RPCS3. Using a powerful PC, you too can now experience Metal Gear Solid 4 at a mostly stable 60 frames per second, and it's transformative. For this video, I played through the entirety of the first 2 chapters of the game and part of the 3rd chapter to determine the state of emulation for this game specifically. I ran into a few issues along the way, but the experience was generally good. Chapter 1, set in the Middle East, takes Snake through a series of encounters and cutscenes on the way to Liquid Ocelot. Right from the start, I was impressed with the increased fidelity and faster input response. It actually feels almost like a native PC version of MGS4, at least when it's running at its best. That said, it's certainly not perfect. Some of the heavier scenes exhibit noticeable drops in performance. I spent a lot of time tweaking my settings looking for a solution, but I was not able to overcome the drops in specific scenes. Of course, to be fair, the scenes that slow down in RPCS3 are the ones that run really badly on a real PlayStation 3, as you can see. I will say that VRR does mostly solve this issue though if you're using such a display, but it's useless for capturing. So which version of RPCS3 am I using then? Well, that's the thing. To achieve maximum performance, I settled on the Cypher XOF custom RPCS build designed for MGS4 or Metal Gear Online. But this is based on an older version of RPCS3 with various hacks in place to maximize frame rate. As a result, it exhibits some minor glitches and visual bugs, such as flickering normal maps in select sequences and the pixelation of the sun effect in others. The main version of RPCS3, however, does currently support Metal Gear Solid 4 as well, and it does produce more accurate visuals, but in its current state it does also run slower, making hitting 60 frames per second very difficult to achieve. I'm told, however, that the team is aware of this issue, so perhaps in the future, the main build will offer a much smoother experience. I will go into more details on the actual settings I used shortly, but first, let's look at our first comparison against the PlayStation 3 original, starting with the game's introduction sequence. It makes a strong first impression. Most of the visual effects seem to be intact, but it's much sharper and clearer. The unique depth of field and heat haze effects are completely intact here as well. In addition, things like power lines are dramatically sharper and cleaner thanks to the higher internal resolution, and this applies to other things in the game such as trees as well. When running on a PlayStation 3, the native resolution of this game is just 1024 by 768, which is a strange choice as it's a 4x3 resolution, but it's displayed within a 720p container, so you're basically looking at non-square pixels in the final output. Now, when displayed at a higher resolution, it doesn't look quite as pin sharp as you might expect, and I think this is partly due to the way the image itself is filtered. It basically acts as a form of anti-aliasing. Now, as we proceed then, even in this very first scene, it's clear that the performance on PS3 tanks, and much of the sequence plays out at just 20 frames per second. With RPCS3, however, it's so much smoother now, at least on this PC. Another surprising improvement though stems from the shadow maps. This was the first Metal Gear Solid title to rely on cascaded shadow maps, but the quality is exceptionally low, with pixelated edges galore. When increasing the internal resolution of the game via RPCS3, however, this has an impact on the shadows themselves, greatly improving clarity in the process. It basically solves most of the problems with shadows in this game. They're not perfect, mind you, but it's a huge improvement. The same is true of the texture filtering. Textures now appear much cleaner at sharp angles, though it's true the resolution of these assets does leave a lot to be desired in certain places, at least from a modern perspective. Now, as noted earlier, there are some visual glitches that become evident in scenes like this. The PS3 side showcases how it should look, but on our PCS3, both this version and the main branch exhibit normal map behavior that is incorrect. This is another scene though where the boost in performance is extremely welcome. The PlayStation 3 struggles to maintain a stable 30 FPS here with huge dips below this, but on our PCS3, at least with a powerful enough PC, it just blitzes right through. And really, that's what makes this generation so appealing when it comes to emulation in the first place. These machines were already designed for HD displays, but they tend to fall short in terms of image quality and performance by today's standards. With consoles older than this generation, however, I've often found that increasing rendering resolution, at least for 3D games, often shatters the illusion the developers intended, producing results that don't necessarily gel with the artwork. But the PS3 generation really is perfect for these types of improvements. This persists into the next major sequence with Snake in the cemetery. Otacon steps off the chopper with the plants whipping around violently as a result. It's a beautiful scene, and our first opportunity to see these characters rendered with a new level of fidelity, but again, it strains the PlayStation 3, producing sluggish performance that our PCS3 solves handily, even in the main build by the way. After additional scenes then were eventually handed back control, which kind of highlights one of the game's largest issues. There's just too many cutscenes here, and you don't get to play the game nearly enough. Pushing forward though, I did encounter this curious glitch with the emulator. So on PlayStation 3, when you crawl beneath this rubble, the game plays a scripted sequence depicting, well, this. With our PCS3 however, across all builds I should note, that same sequence instead played out like this each time. The character basically falls to the ground, but then hops back up briefly to run into the wall before collapsing a second time. Possibly the nanomachines in action? It's unclear. Another fun comparison though, hiding amongst the statues with Solid Snake, I suppose? Moving on then, we're treated to the sequence introducing Metal Gear Mark II. This is the one that's based on what we saw in the 2005 trailer. One of the interesting things I noted here though is how the increased resolution impacts the LCD filter used on the Mark II itself. You can now clearly see the individual red, green, and blue subpixel elements used to create this effect. It's pretty cool. You may have also noticed that during these cutscenes I've been using various camo patterns on Snake on RPCS3, and that's because I'm playing with an Xbox controller. You see, normally, the game uses the motion sensing functions of the 6-axis or DualShock 3 to reset the camo. You just shake the controller to do so. But I've been playing this with an Xbox controller that has no such function available and not enough buttons to add it in. From what I understand, it's possible to use controllers with this functionality built in, including the DualShock 4, restoring the intended function. This next sequence out on the street is where I first noticed huge performance drops in RPCS3 during normal gameplay. But it's so much worse on PlayStation 3 of course. But eventually you make your way into this underground bunker, and it's here that I noticed another minor visual glitch in the emulator. On PlayStation 3, when using the night vision, Snake's entire body is highlighted, but on RPCS3, only his head receives this effect. It's strange. This is another decent gameplay driven situation that I did enjoy, I have to admit. But then after this, once again, the game takes control away from the player and asks you to watch this very strange cutscene introducing Drebin, the arms dealer. I've always wondered if Kojima based this guy off the merchant in Resident Evil 4. Once you take control back, however, you make your way through a collapsed building, and then we come to perhaps the most important comparison of all.
Diarrhea.
Who's there?
Go away! I'm not done yet!
Yes, this is unfortunately a hallmark of Metal Gear Solid 4. Johnny's intestinal antics. Anytime he's present in the scene, you're basically flooded with the sound of intestinal distress and poop jokes, and yeah, I kind of feel like this doesn't hold up all that well. I'd be curious to hear what the meetings were like amongst the staff when it was decided to go all the way in on diarrhea. Once you take control back, however, you're treated to the longest gameplay segment yet before arriving in this building. If you recall, it's the one area on PlayStation 3 that actually reaches 60 frames per second, at least when using night vision. The main benefit here on RPCS3 is the improved shadow maps. Once you go upstairs though, you'll reconnect with Meryl in this cutscene, you know, Meryl from Metal Gear Solid 1, before you're handed control back once again. And by the way, I love the way this game transitions from cutscenes into gameplay, but unfortunately that feeling is dashed very quickly when RPCS3 crashes. Yes, this is the first crash I encountered, and this problem caused significant headaches for me during the creation of this video, so I want to highlight the actual solution here. Basically, at various points throughout the game, specifically when these frog enemies are used in a scene, the game would basically just seize up like this. The only way I could progress initially was switching to a much slower OpenGL based renderer, completing the scene, then going back to Vulkan. But after reaching out for assistance and failing to find a solution through settings tweaks, it turns out the problem was hidden in plain sight all along. It's the anti-aliasing setting. I had left this on default, which is auto, not even thinking for a moment that it could be related to anything. Yet it turns out that if this setting is configured to anything other than disabled, the game crashes when using Vulkan, at least on my system. It's really that simple. Now, this only applies to the custom RPCS3 build, by the way. It's not an issue with the main build, but it's definitely something to be aware of if you're trying to target these higher frame rates possible in this build. Alright, so let's talk about the other settings while we're here. So yeah, you'll want to use Vulkan for starters, and since the game is mostly CPU dependent, any reasonably powerful GPU should be able to increase the internal resolution. I'm using 3840 by 2160 here, but reducing this had zero impact on performance in my case, as I was always CPU bound in heavy sequences. Secondly, the resolution scale threshold should be 256 by 256 to match the 300% boost to resolution. You'll also want to enable right color buffers. I didn't use this initially, and that's what causes the mismatch in color in specific scenes like this. Enable it, and everything's restored to normal. I used the rest of the default settings elsewhere that shipped with this build. This chapter wraps up with a bombastic cutscene featuring a huge number of characters, so performance was not flawless during this sequence, but I think you have a good idea what to expect in this initial chapter, so let's skip ahead to the next part. So chapter 2 takes Snake to a South American inspired mountain pass. Unlike chapter 1, this one actually features proper vegetation and trees, and its mission design feels more like a continuation of the work started on Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater. As a result, it's probably the best chapter in the game from a pure gameplay perspective, and it works extremely well in RPCS3 overall. It's true that some of the heavier areas do exhibit performance dips on my system, but it is a dramatic improvement over real hardware. That said, there are some minor visual glitches to mention. Firstly, during the cutscene introducing you to this new location, you run across Vamp, originally from Metal Gear Solid 2. Problem is, the physics-driven dog tags he's wearing behave improperly in the emulator, so they sort of jiggle around in a strange way in motion, and this is a problem I noticed with other physics-driven dangly bits. Secondly, later in this mission, you'll cross a small river, and unfortunately this version of RPCS3 seems unable to draw the water correctly as Snake moves through it. The surface is corrupt, with this stark vertical line running from top to bottom. To the left of that line, you do see the ripples from moving through the water, but to the right of it, it's just the static water texture. Again, this chapter is really pretty interesting, I'd say. There's a lot of cool maps to explore, lots of freedom in how you approach each scenario, and some excellent set pieces, including this first boss fight, which is quite enjoyable. After this boss fight then, you'll engage in a tracking exercise, which again reminds me of Metal Gear Solid 3, before entering a turret sequence as you escape from this area with Drebin. But this part actually highlights another complaint I have with playing this via RPCS3, at least when aiming for a complete playthrough. Essentially, the game needs to stop for PPU compilation between each area, so when you arrive at a new loading screen, it requires more time than it does on an actual PlayStation 3, at least on your first playthrough. Due to the way the turret sequence is designed, however, with a series of maps all divided by loading screens, you'll run across this often, and it does sort of deflate the pacing in this sequence. The main build can perform a much longer initial compilation process, which does reduce this problem, but I wasn't able to trigger it in the special MGS4 build, so it's something to keep in mind if you want to attempt a full playthrough. One of the other later areas in this chapter then floods the scene with geckos, and this scene also exhibits major performance problems on my system. Which, by the way, if I haven't mentioned it already, I'm using an Intel 12900K processor. I disabled the E-cores so that I could enable AVX 512, which is beneficial for RPCS3. I'm also using an RTX 3090 graphics card. So yeah, it's a very high-end machine, and I can't promise you'll be able to get this level of performance on a lesser machine. But that's okay, because you can still cap the game at 30 frames per second and have a cleaner, more consistent experience than on a real PlayStation 3. But yeah, I think you're starting to get the idea here. When talking about emulation like this, it's really important, at least to me, to consider the experience a player might have during a proper full playthrough. And at this point, it does feel like we're getting close to something really truly great, but the minor glitches and hangups still ultimately have a slightly negative impact on the whole thing. The thing is though, as I said, we're getting really close, and there's times when it feels almost like you're playing a proper native PC version of the game, which suggests with some additional tweaks and changes to the RPCS code, it could actually get there. In fact, with other games, it really is almost perfect right now. As for MGS4 itself, well, revisiting this game was rather eye-opening. It confirmed what I had suspected, that this is the weakest entry in the series. Audis Early has claimed that it's a terrible game, and I wouldn't necessarily go that far, but I do think it simply tries to answer way too many questions and gets bogged down by cutscenes and nanomachines. I did enjoy this in 2008, but a proper re-release would need some serious changes, I think. It's a shame too, as the core mechanics are excellent. With more actual gameplay and a reduction in the number of cutscenes, it could have actually been a great experience, but as it is, it's just a little too unbalanced for me. Still, this was a worthwhile experiment that has greatly increased my interest in following the development of RPCS3. It's unlikely we'll ever see anything like this in an official capacity, and I'm equally convinced that the PS5 CPU isn't even up to fully emulating the PS3 in the first place. But if you want to see more reporting in the future on RPCS3 though, do let us know. Because as far as this video is concerned, we've reached the end. So let us know if you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time.